All right, let's get started. My name is John Horning, and I'm the Executive Director of WildEarth Guardians. It's good to see you all. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We've got Guardian supporters from all over the country taking part in this webinar, from the East Coast to the West Coast, and lots of supporters up and down the Rocky Mountains. So thank you all for joining us. There's nothing like gathering in person, but these virtual forums are still nice for us to connect with Guardian supporters and create at least some sense of community. When we put together these WildEarth webinars, we like to bring together issue experts, sometimes even elected officials, oftentimes people from frontline communities, and almost always WildEarth Guardians staff. And we like to talk about critical issues at a critical time. Our purpose is always to inform, to inspire, and to activate Guardians like you to help us advance our vision, drive change, and create the kind of world that we want. We like to make this as interactive as possible. That means we like to hear from you all. We hope to take as many questions as possible. So there's a Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom box. So please put your questions in that Q&A box, and I will do my very best to get to as many questions as possible. We are convening today at a great time, at a time of significant transition for the world, for the American West, and for WildEarth Guardians. I am leaving Guardians next month after nearly 3 decades with the organization. But the work of transitioning our region away from extractive and exploitive economies to more restorative and harmonious policies and laws and practices will continue. And so this webinar, excuse me, is all about transition within Guardians. And with that in mind, I wanted our members and supporters to get a chance to meet several of Guardians' longstanding and some new leaders. These are all program directors, excuse me again, each of whom is an expert of one kind or another in wildlife, land, water, or climate issues. We have Andrew Rothman, who is our Wild Places Program Director, Kelly Fuller, who is Guardians Climate and Energy Program Director, Lindsay Larris, who is Guardians Wildlife Program Director, and Samantha Ruscavage-Barz, who is Guardians Legal Director. Welcome, Andrew, Kelly, Lindsay, and Sam, to this WildEarth Guardians webinar. I am looking forward to the conversation. So we are going to start with that theme of transition that I mentioned in my introduction. Each of you is engaged in one form or another in the work of transition from old extractive ways to new, more harmonious ways of living with the natural world. So I'd like for each of you to check in around this theme of transitioning away from systems, structures, and cultures that benefit the extractive and exploitive exploitive economies and cultures to those that are more protective and restorative. Why don't we start with you, Andrew, on this theme of transition and how you see your work embodying that theme?
Sure. Well, thanks, John. First, glad to be here, and thanks to all of you who have come today. I'm really happy to have you here as well. In response to your question, really since colonial times and the implementation of Manifest Destiny here in the U.S., we've been exploiting our natural resources, decimating populations of wildlife, and really unraveling ecological connections to the point now where climate change is even changing the currents of the ocean. But I don't think it has to be that way. reconnecting in life happens. Maybe we even start a slogan, reconnecting happens. Even coming out of COVID, we're reconnecting with each other as humans and our human relationships, and restoration and ecological processes can be restored as well. So our work as the Wild Places program is to halt projects on public land that decrease connectivity, such as those that increase roads or increase habitat fragmentation. So we're looking to find ways to increase connectivity on our public lands and make landscapes more permeable for large carnivores. So, from glacier to the Gila, trying to find ways to connect our habitats, whether it's from one grizzly bear recovery zone to another. We're looking to restore and increase connectivity and ecological processes rather than transition away from it. So really leaning into connectivity, which could be seen as almost an antithesis of exploitation in some ways.
Beautiful. I love that theme of connectivity, as you touched on, both from the perspective of human relationship and from the perspective of trying to stitch the natural world back together. So connectivity is a big theme there for the Wild Places program. How about you, Lindsay? Through that lens of transition, what's your introductory thoughts about the work of the wildlife program?
Yeah, John. As many folks know, wildlife management across the West has been rooted primarily in permitting wildlife to exist, so long as it doesn't interfere with human interests, and that's been going on for over 100 years and longer than that. It's particularly true with respect to public lands and the interests of ranching and agriculture owners. We've seen a big shift in public opinion over the past decade plus towards wildlife that should be valued for its inherent purpose and its inherent value, and away from wildlife should only exist to fulfill human ends. What we need to do is to have a system or systems of wildlife management that really represent that shift in public values. So the wildlife program's work is constantly focused on how to change the systems to better reflect the broader public sentiment and belief that humans and wildlife can and must mutually coexist in nature in order to further our interests as well, the interests of the ecosystems at large. And we're doing this coexistence work through pushing to fundamentally reform state wildlife management agencies to represent a broader swath of the public, and not just sort of special particular interest groups as they historically have been. Also by promoting federal and state policies that focus on conflict reduction as a means to coexist with wildlife versus lethal management and killing to just sort of get rid of the problem and not try to find that solution.
Beautiful. Love that theme of coexistence. And I also appreciate your opening remarks about the fact that society is changing, and we have the broader public really wants humanity to figure out ways to coexist. And I'll just remark that in my 30 years at Guardians, that shift has been much more dramatic than I ever envisioned. So let's continue to meet the demands of the American public, the American people who want us to figure out how to live more harmonious with the natural world. Thank you, Lindsay. Kelly, what about you? What are your opening thoughts about how your work in our climate energy program speaks to that theme of transition?
Yeah, so I've been at Guardians about a month, but I've been doing this kind of work for a long time all over the US. And in the climate and energy program, we are continuing WildEarth Guardians' pioneering work of keeping federal oil, gas, and coal in the ground, which is absolutely necessary for this transition, John, that you're talking about to take place. And what that means is a lot of the time we are very literally guardians, and to the oil, gas, and coal industries, we look like a flashing red stop sign because transition's a time of something new being born, and new things births are very vulnerable. And we have to safeguard the wholeness and integrity of wild places, wildlife, wild rivers, and human communities. So we really are guardians to keep that federal oil, gas, and coal in the ground.
Thank you, Kelly. I especially appreciate your reflections about that Guardians takes on big challenges, and we're not trying to rearrange small things that are symptomatic of deeper fundamental problems. And that work requires not only spirited engagement from each of you, but sustained support and, you know, a desire to really think long term. So thank you to each of you for bringing your life force to the work of deep systemic change. It's incredibly rewarding, I know, but it's also deeply challenging. So again, thank you. I think that's a good question, or a good segue to another question, kind of an introductory question that I wanted to ask, which is, and maybe you could pick one particular aspect of the broader themes that you touched on, but what excites you about the work that you're engaged in? And maybe we could start with you, Sam, since we didn't hear from you in the opening remarks. Sam, again, is our legal director, but let's share with our audience from at least several of you, what excites you, what enrolls your spirit? You're muted, Sam. That's all right.
Just by way of background, I was the staff attorney before I became legal director. So I was a staff attorney for about 10 years, and I did primarily climate and energy litigation and wild rivers litigation. And so through doing that work, a theme that we've always had with our legal actions in Guardians was really bringing that justice lens and that fairness lens around interests that were not just consumptive interests around using resources on our federal land and using them to the extent that they resulted in air pollution that impacted people. And so we are continuing to do that work in all of the programs and continuing to provide that seat at the table for nature, for people, for the planet, through the litigation that we bring. It gives us that seat at the table that we might not ordinarily have, because the interests that Guardians and its members have around nature and the wild and clean air and clean water do not line the pockets of politicians. And so we're always fighting against these big behemoths and trying to get those interests out there and trying to really affect systemic big agency reform of agencies like the Bureau of Land Management, for example, and also Fish and Wildlife Service. And so what I'm most excited, well, I'm excited that we are continuing to do that work, that we're continuing to have success in that area. And what we're really bringing to it, we are involved in supporting co-plaintiffs in a case with frontline community members against the state of New Mexico for not providing New Mexico citizens with the right to a healthy environment that the New Mexico Constitution says is required. And we're approaching that through the lens of the state's lack of regulation, strict regulation of oil and gas development. And so bringing that forward, being able to elevate those community voices, being able to elevate the interests of clean air and clean water, and really trying to affect big change in state government across the regulatory landscape, trying to shine a light on the true cost of oil and gas development to people, to communities, to the ecosystem, and not just seeing the state prop up this development and just sidelining or completely ignoring those impacts, those kind of non-consumptive, non-monetary, the impacts, and not absorbing the true cost and pushing that onto people.
Thank you, Sam. Just listening to you reminds me that Sam's been with Guardians for around 15 years, give or take a year. So appreciate your endurance and your long commitment, not only to the work of justice for the climate, for rivers, and for the communities that are impacted, but also for your commitment to Guardians. I'm grateful for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome, Sam. I'm also, Guardians has grown and diversified our theory of change, and the legal tool has been a vital tool for Guardians since our inception. So it's great to see us continue to fight really big fights through the courts, because the courts can sometimes be the forum of last resort for all the things that we care about to get a fair and just consideration. Lindsay, you wanna check in on maybe one additional thing about your work that excites you?
Sure. I mean, kind of playing off of what Sam said and what you just said, John, about courts being this last resort. I think what I'm excited about is that we at Guardians in the Wildlife Program thinking about how to leverage multiple arenas for our fights and thinking about states, federal, the legal system as well, agencies, legislatures. And I think about, for an example, like looking at wolves, and we have, Fish and Wildlife Service going to issue a decision on the Northern Rocky Mountain wolves. At the same time, we're not going to just rely on that one decision and potentially taking that to court to protect wolves. We have a state case going on in Montana right now. We have action happening in Colorado with wolf reintroduction. We are looking at multiple places on how to impact change for a species and not just relying on one and saying, let's throw all of our eggs in one basket. And I think we're getting really good as an organization at thinking about creative, various solutions to a problem and not just relying on one way to tackle it.
I love that reflection, because it speaks to me. Like, we've always tried to use legal tools in a creative way, and that's, I think, a core value of Guardians. So thank you for continuing that work going forward of what creative tool can we use to help advance change that maybe no other group is thinking about. That's again a distinct role for Guardians. Before we move on, anyone else want to, either Andrew or Kelly? If not, we'll move on, but you want to check in with one quick thing about what excites you?
I'll happy to just jump in quick. I'll make it brief. This, of course, is the 100-year anniversary of America and really the world's first wilderness area, the Gila Wilderness. So I'm excited that we're going to be celebrating that and also pushing for an expanded vision for protection and connectivity in the Gila. And then just in wild places, we have a number of litigation opportunities as well that we're teeing up, again, to challenge the Forest Service as well as other land management agencies. And so excited to bring those forward this year.
Speak to just one of those, little more detail about one of the lawsuits that you think might have the potential to drive significant change, and why it's important from your perspective.
Well, I don't know if I want to get into it too much, but in particular, we have some issues with grazing, trespass grazing in particular. And so there's some opportunities to work with multiple management agencies and really hold their feet to the fire in terms of their responsibility to those that have leases for cattle on our public lands, and those that are trespassing to areas where they shouldn't and causing impact. Really think that there's a need to, again, hold them responsible and make sure that if they can't stop illegal grazing from happening on our public lands in certain places, then we're gonna have to stop that from happening.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. It's just a reminder that sometimes the work of Guardians is basic accountability, to hold scofflaws and outlaws accountable to the law. So thank you for that work as well. I wanted to ask another question that's, again, fairly broad, but I think helps provide insight into why people do this work and what motivates them. And it's really based on the reality that we live in incredibly challenging times where we've got compounding crises, biodiversity crises, climate crisis, sort of economic and equity crisis. And each of them mean that there's a lot of energy focused at challenging these long-standing systems. And that's a good thing. And yet driving change in that kind of environment can lead people to feel cynical or pessimistic. Our work, the work of any change advocate, requires a high level of belief. I'm wondering if one or two of you could share what nourishes your sense of optimism. And I'll have you go first, Sam, but if anyone else feels inspired to speak to how you do this work when it's just so demanding and again, sometimes can lead us to despair.
Sure. Thanks, John. And I'll just tee off of what Lindsay said is it's not just one tactic or one strategy that gets us there. And it's not just one lawsuit that gets us to where we want to go, because when you are trying to move the courts, which is a lot of what Guardians does, we bring novel cases, we try to move the law in a certain direction, we are bringing a lot of cases of first impression, and there are a lot of losses. I mean, I lost a bunch of cases for like my first 5 years before we really started winning on oil and gas and climate issues and getting BLM to take climate impacts of fossil fuel development seriously. And so it takes a lot of court cases, for example, a lot of court cases to move the court to get to a point where now courts are saying to BLM, you have to look at cumulative climate impacts of all of this fossil fuel development. Like, you can't just be brushing these things under the rug. You can't just be rubber stamping. And I liken it to some of the civil rights litigation, like how many cases it took to get to Brown v. Board of Education, the school desegregation case, how many cases it took to get some of the marriage equality wins that we've gotten. It's a long road, but knowing that it takes multiple steps together to get there, knowing that a loss in court can sometimes be a win because it pushes the issue forward in other areas. It can mobilize the public, it can mobilize other entities, and then you build on those losses to get to that case that takes you to that win. And so I have always felt really grateful to be able to do this work, to be able to be part of that important fight. And that's really what I use to sustain myself when there have been a series of, nights and weekends working on briefs and then losses and having to appeal and having to kind of keep going at it, is that it's going to take a lot. It's not going to be just a single lawsuit, and it's important work to be doing. And we make incremental progress every time, even where there are losses.
Thank you, Sam. Yeah, it's a good reminder. As much as we are obviously fiercely proud of and in this moment focused on WildEarth Guardians work, we are nested in a much broader movement, and that's a powerful movement with lots of public support at local, state, and federal levels. And so we're not alone. So thank you for that, Sam. Anyone else want to do a quick check-in on that?
Can I? Yeah. Fewer than 200,000 people are employed by the oil, gas, and coal industries, but 335 million people in the United States need to breathe clean air, drink clean water, and live in a habitable climate. So when I get down, I just remind myself the numbers are on our side. So we're going to prevail long term, and we just got to keep plugging away at it.
Thank you, Kelly.
And I build on that too, just kind of the power of people and the power, again, of connectivity. The opportunity to educate and engage more people as they're seeing the impacts of climate change, as they're seeing their favorite wild places degraded. I think there's great opportunity to educate people about how public lands are being managed and actually the agency they have in that process. So helping people to use their voice and challenge the status quo and engage in process. That opportunity gives me optimism, and the fact that there's more and more people joining this effort gives me hope.
Thank you, Andrew. I think I imagine for each of you, as for me, optimism is just hardwired into our DNA. You can't do this kind of work without believing that you can drive change against tremendous odds. So thank you all for bringing that piece of yourselves that believes you can be a part of a powerful change, even though we're up against it many days. I want to ask you, Lindsay, a question about a vital law that we use, and then I'll get to one or two audience questions. And this is about the Endangered Species Act, which, as many of you know, celebrated just about a month ago its 50th anniversary. It's hard for me to believe that that law is as young as it is. It's been a vital tool in so much of Guardian's work over the years. Recognizing the intrinsic value of wildlife is a core Guardian's value. So my question for you, Lindsay, is what do you think the federal government at sort of the administrative level or the congressional level could do to make the act more effective to stem the extinction crisis over the next 50 years?
Yeah, it's something that I think a lot of us, both, at Guardians and other groups, and probably folks who are watching this right now have been thinking about. We have this great law, and the problem with it is that it does not get implemented the way that it was supposed to be implemented 50 years ago. I've been thinking recently, like, how many species have actually been recovered, actually gotten off that list, and that's the goal. And I think putting more effort into not just having token populations that can languish on for years, but actually getting species to recover and to fully recover so that they can be removed from the list and be in a good place is something that the government really should be focusing on. And part of that is putting more funding into the ESA and into stemming the species crisis. I can't recall off the top of my head what the figures are, but the sort of percentage of money that goes into actually working to stem biodiversity crisis is such a small piece of what we spend on the federal government. Right now, it still takes 14 years for a species to go from petition to listing. And that's just unacceptable if we're going to actually stop extinction from happening to species. So really focusing on putting some more funding towards that for species to recover in the long term and not just stay on that list forever is something that I'd really like to see in the future.
Thank you, Lindsay. Just a quick follow-up there. Could you speak to what we need from our members just broadly in order to drive the kind of change that you just articulated?
What we've been seeing is a lot of efforts to cut down the ESA, to use political means to delist species instead of science. Stopping that in its tracks is the first thing. Really standing up and saying, like, this is unacceptable. This has no place here. When there's budgetary discussions, to actually have members of Congress supporting listing decisions and biodiversity as a really key piece of stemming climate crisis, stemming biodiversity crisis, and stepping forward for that. We've seen some champions, but it always seems that species sort of get this lowest priority. It's like we have to worry about human needs first, and that are like right now on fire, literally sometimes, and then worry about the species. But if we want long-term survival of our ecosystems, it all has to be together, and really having more champions in Congress speaking up to that need is really important.
Thank you for that, Lindsay. We don't have any action alerts today as a part of this webinar. We often do, but know for all of our audience members today that we will be calling on you throughout this year to act it is a core part of what it means to be a guardian. So look for lots of calls to action in the coming months and throughout the year. So I'd like to get to a couple of questions from our audience members. The first one's going to come right back to you, Lindsay. This is from Kate In. Kate says, hi, I would like to know if WildEarth Guardians has intentions to protect and fight more intensively for wolves. And actually, maybe you could speak to that, Andrew, as well as a follow-up through the lens of the systemic work of permanent retirement. But Lindsay, why don't you touch on maybe from like real briefly the Northern Rockies to the Southwest, our work on wolves.
Sure. We could talk for hours about our work on wolves, so I'll try to just briefly think about it. So coming up very soon, we're going to see a listing decision on the Northern Rocky Mountain wolves, and we are definitely committed to challenging that decision if it denies that listing, because those wolves certainly need to be listed in order to be protected, and we've been fighting for that for years. We've seen what Montana and Idaho and the other Northern Rocky Mountain states have done when they have management authority, and it's not going to create a recovered population. And I think really pushing for the federal government to recognize that at this point probably will take litigation if that decision is negative. We have state litigation going on in Montana trying to challenge their state management of wolves, which has been egregious for years. In Colorado, we're working to make sure that the reintroduction process is going to go smoothly, that I'm sorry, I live in Colorado, so I do say we can do better here than we've seen our neighbors to the north. I think really engaging politicians as well as the community in Colorado to make sure that the reintroduction does not turn into a bloody massacre like it has in the Northern Rockies. Super important. We've been working on Lobos, Mexican wolves in the Southwest for many years as well. We are working to push the boundary, that's artificial political boundary of I-40, where they go north of that and they get taken back down. We want that boundary to go away. We think that there needs to be wolves be able to go across their historic range freely. This is not an outdoor zoo that we live in. This is the wild, and we want animals to be able to live in the wild as they are intended to.
Thank you, Lindsay. You know what I can say without any bias, because I've only been a guardian for 30 years, is that our wolf work is singular. We work in coalition with other groups, but if you really dig into our wolf advocacy work, whether it's in the Northern Rockies in Montana or down here in the Southwest in New Mexico and Arizona, Guardians is playing a very distinctive role of pushing the left flank politically and legally. And Lindsay really embodies this work of trying to get the conservation community to recognize the intrinsic value of individual wolves, more of an animal humane ethic, as opposed to a conservation biology ethic, which says as long as the population is fine, we don't need to worry. And again, that's been a cornerstone value of Guardians, that we bring compassion to this work, and compassion is not a principle you apply at a population level. It's a principle you apply at the individual level. So thank you for that work, Lindsay. Another question, there are really two that I'm going to answer myself, and then we'll get back to our script. I say that to the panelists, but I'm going to answer both of them. One is from James Goose. James says, John, is there anything in your 30 years with WildEarth Guardians that stands out in all the work you've done that you would like to share with us? A singular or pivotal moment. And then he says, by the way, thanks for all you have done out there. And then Nicole Wolf says, please share some positive changes you have seen ecologically since WildEarth Guardians has been on the ground. And this is from Nicole Wolf of West Wolf Medicinals. So I'm going to share a brief story, which is that I was once backpacking in the Gila Wilderness. And on the 5th and final day, evening, having not heard wolves for the first 4 days and nights or seen them, we heard wolves howling. It was a beautiful thing. This was the first time that I'd ever heard wolves howl. And it's a long story, but the brief version is that those were members of the Middle Fork Pack. We were camped on the rim of the Middle Fork of the Gila River. And about a month later, I learned that both the alpha male and the alpha female of that pack each had only 3 legs. One, the victim of a gunshot wound, the other, the victim of a trap. In both cases, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service made the difficult decision to amputate one of the legs of each of those alpha members of that pack. Think about this, the resilience of those animals to live on 3 legs. They reared pups, they lived their lives. But this happened, both of these incidents of violence against these wolves, in the Gila wilderness, America's first wilderness. And when I learned that story after hearing those wolves, it just broke my heart. But we've, thanks to the work of long-term staff member Chris Smith and Lindsay and others on Guardian staff, we've banned trap, snares, and poisons on public lands in New Mexico. And we're taking that work to other states. And I feel very proud of that work and related work confronting livestock grazing abuses on public lands, where 30 years ago, we saw streams that were grazed to the bone. And now those streams have come back to life. And we've got beavers, these ecological engineers, living on those streams simply because of the return of habitat. And so when I think about how critical it is, or how we can go about living in greater harmony, we need ecosystem engineer species like wolves, like beavers, to be given the freedom to roam, to thrive, to exist. And if we do that, then nature can heal itself and be resilient in the face of the unfortunate changes that humanity is driving due to climate change. So those are 2 quick examples of things that I'm proud of and positive change that we've seen in this case, in the last really 10 years. So we're doing well for time. I'd like to get to talking about kind of the interrelationship between state and federal policy change. Historically, Guardians worked primarily to influence federal policy in all kinds of forums, land, wildlife, water. But in the last really decade to decade and a half, we've changed our own theory of change and we've diversified our approaches. And we've done so by engaging in state level work, especially on climate and wildlife issues. So I'd like to just briefly highlight some of that state level work and have both Lindsay and Kelly describe how that work is valuable in and of itself and how it influences and synergizes with federal law and policy. So Kelly, if you could go first and then Lindsay.
Okay, so we are jumping in New Mexico to get harmful forever chemicals that can contaminate drinking water banned from future use in oil and gas drilling. We're also, and this is in a state rulemaking in New Mexico, and we're also working in that rulemaking to get mandatory disclosure of all of the chemicals that the oil and gas industry uses when they're doing that drilling. And we're really hopeful that we're going to get this. And we're doing this in response because all over the US, communities hate that they can't get the industry to tell them what they're using. And the federal government really backs companies up in this lack of disclosure. And the government says, oh, well, they don't say what they're using and, you know, we're not going to make them. This is a trade secret. We are really hopeful that we're going to be able to make progress on this in New Mexico. And if we get this, we are then going to really push the federal government to make changes and do this so that people can get this both at the federal level, and we're hopeful that other states will adopt it as well. So New Mexico is the place that we're pushing, and we're hopeful that we will be able to then see federal changes later. So that's the one that we're really pushing now, with hopes that we'll be able to leverage it for federal use later.
Thank you, Kelly. Our governor here in New Mexico, Michelle Lujan Grisham, is going to face a test of ethics, because she's been outspoken on the PFAS issue in the context of the military and the Cannon Air Force Base. But let's see if she has the will and integrity to do so in the context of the oil and gas industry. And, you know, in terms of, I'll draw my own connection there. We've got to chip away at the political and economic influence of the oil and gas industry in state contexts and venues, so that we can drive big federal change as well. What about you, Lindsay? Thoughts about state work that we're doing in Colorado and or New Mexico, and how that's valuable in and of itself, and how it relates to federal change?
Yeah, and you know, for wildlife, a lot of the management does happen at the state level. So we have like this sort of different system aside from endangered species and certain agencies like U.S. Department of Agriculture and APHIS. We are having a lot of decisions about how wildlife is managed happening at the state level, even on federal lands. So we have to kind of think about that in our approaches as well. As you touched on, John, the trapping ban in New Mexico was huge in and of itself. That happened in, now I'm blanking on the time, from 2019, was that right?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. And, you know, I think that was a really big moment of passing that through legislation, banned traps, but also poisons. And we have sort of seen some momentum in other states to do similar bills, and at least to reform their trapping. But then really interestingly, you know, in the fall, the Bureau of Land Management decided to end the use of sodium cyanide bombs on federal land, on BLM land, which is huge, and something that, John, I know has been really important for you for your many years at Guardians to get some sort of federal ban. And I think that, you know, as it has been an amalgamation of states really banning these bombs, banning traps, like thinking about these things happening at state levels to really give momentum for the federal government to take some action. You know, and we're hopeful that that will eventually turn into permanent legislation and not just an MOU that we have on sodium cyanide. In Colorado, we're obviously working on wolf issues. But another thing that we've been pushing here is reforming the State Wildlife Commission. Traditionally, we've seen these commissions mostly agricultural interests, ranchers, hunters, and not really thinking about all the other non-consumptive users as having any voice in managing wildlife. And there's been a big change happening in Colorado over the past 4 years. And I think that is getting noticed in other states, and that's getting noticed about, hey, wait, people who are not hunting and fishing actually still care about wildlife. We should give them a voice, and we're seeing that more and more, and hoping that influences how some federal policymakers make decisions and thinking about, you know, how wildlife management decisions impact other people aside from those that they traditionally think of as impacted.
Thank you for that, Lindsay. I'll just offer my brief perspective on the state work, which is to say that 30 years ago, as a young lad, I thought naively that we can just drive federal change because it was the right and just thing to do. And, you know, what I've learned over time is that state level engagement is vital as an incubator, and as Lindsay was saying, to demonstrate that there is political support for what then could be bolder policy changes that are never going to happen in states like Wyoming, Idaho, even Montana and Utah. And so in terms of state forums, we have to pick the right forums to build political will, recognizing that some states are never going to be the right forums to drive state level change, at least not at the legislative level, perhaps using litigation as a tool. So I also just want to say quickly that it's really beneficial if and when the federal government gets controlled by the party not in power today we have state forums to drive change. So that allows us to sort of nimbly pivot some of our resources that might have been engaged in federal change to try to drive more change at the state level.
I just want to add on that, John. I think that's a good point. I had that in one of my answers somewhere about, we do have sort of these, I don't want to call them backups, but I think we not just focusing on the federal piece. We don't come to a time if we have a different administration that we have no options available. We're only playing defense for 4 years. We have places that we can play offense still, and that's, I think, what makes Guardians really special.
Yep. All right, I want to just briefly take 5 minutes to cover this next subject, which is a big subject, but we're just going to touch on it, which is, and the reason I want to do that is because I want to get to audience questions. But the subject is the U.S. Departments of Agriculture and Interior under the Biden administration. We're in the final year of what we hope will be the first of a 2-term Biden administration. That is not to say we love everything Biden's done, but we know who his opponent will be. We almost certainly know who it's going to be, I should say. So that said, what rulemakings or other policy initiatives, good or bad, should we be looking for from the Biden administration's interior or ag departments? And while I ask this question of you, Kelly, Andrew, and Lindsay, I'm also asking you to think about this, audience members as well, because we'll be coming to you to engage you on these rulemakings and other things. So why don't we go in reverse order than I had planned? Andrew, then Kelly, then Lindsay, and take 30 seconds take a minute to answer the question.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, Wild Places, of course, there's a number of site-based decisions that we're tracking, including like the Red Cliffs Highway in southern Utah near St. George. But across the West, we're very concerned about policy on mature and old-growth forests. So, of course, mature and old-growth forest, really important, especially as mechanisms to soak up atmospheric carbon. And the administration has started a process to amend all national forest plans to potentially provide greater protections for mature and old-growth forests, in particular potentially from commercial logging. So we're really going to be active in engaging in this, and actually there is an opportunity for folks to sign on right now. There's a petition and comments to protect our climate forests. I think, yeah, Lindsay and maybe Adam even can drop that into the chat. So really pushing for the administration to implement real protections for mature and old growth forests, and not just establish language that can basically create mechanisms for loopholes.
Thank you, Andrew. And I do see there's an action opportunity in the chat box. So if you feel so inspired, we'd love to make sure you raise your voice on behalf of a stronger rule to protect old growth forests on public lands. Kelly, what are you looking for from the Biden administration in the next 10 to 12 months?
Yeah, and I want to just quickly say what Andrew was just talking about with the climate forests and that rulemaking. We've got a listener question about reforestation versus proforestation. To that questioner, what Andrew was talking about, that is what we're thinking about regarding forests and climate. That what Andrew was just talking about, there's your answer right there, what we're thinking about climates and forests. So in the BLM has got the Bureau of Land Management has an oil and gas rulemaking that we're expecting to see a final rule probably this spring or summer. It is a very minor rulemaking. They're just, they're making some positive adjustments, especially in regard to increasing bonding amounts on oil wells, but this is a minor thing. It's not the kind of bold change that we need to see in the oil and gas program. We will see what it looks like, but it is a disappointment that they are not going to make, that they're not going to wind down oil and gas leasing and drilling on federal lands, which is what we really need to see happen in order to stop runaway climate change.
Thank you, Kelly. What about you, Lindsay? I know you've touched on some of these, but briefly, what are we looking at that's coming down the pipe from the Biden administration this year.
Yeah, one of the big things is that we are waiting on a grizzly bear decision to come out quite soon. The states of Montana and Idaho and Wyoming have all petitioned to delist grizzly bears. They think they've recovered. They think everything is just fine and state management would be just fine at this point, which means open season on grizzly bears in some of these states. We've already seen a decision on Idaho denying their petition, but for Wyoming and Montana, we anticipate a 12-month finding, which would be sort of the beginning of the process to delist grizzly bears. And that's something that is going to be a massive deal to the environmental community. It's something that we have for years been trying to say it's not right to delist them at this point, and hopeful that the Biden administration has been listening to those voices and the scientists who have showed that just because there's a number of bears doesn't mean that there's connected populations, as Andrew has talked about, or that there's the genetic diversity necessary for these bears to continue to recover into the future. So that decision is going to be big. We're also waiting for a decision on our petition to the Forest Service, asking for them to implement some rules for non-lethal mandatory practices when there's grazing allowed on Forest Service lands. We've been told that's going to come out sometime this year, so we're looking forward to that decision and to see how they've addressed our request.
Thank you, Lindsay. So stay tuned. We'll be definitely engaging our membership to make sure your voices are heard, to oppose any inane regulation rule on the part of Interior to strip away protections for grizzlies. I'd like to get some questions, some questions from our audience members. We're going to go fairly rapid fire here. This one is from Tom Reeby, a longtime Guardians member. I'm hopeful that Colorado wolves will make their way into New Mexico eventually. The Pecos wilderness is ready. Is this something Guardians would support? Lindsay?
Yeah, I mean, we want wolves to thrive and go across to their historic range. I don't know if that is in the cards right now, but we definitely support that. We also have to think about the impact it will have on Mexican wolves without having a buffer population. So it's all things that we're thinking about and talking with the administration in Colorado and hopefully to the New Mexico administration about as well.
I look forward to hearing the howl of wolves from my backyard on the edge of the southern Sangres, just a few miles, not only from Tom Reeby's home, but from the Pecos wilderness. Thank you for that question, Tom. Lindsay, you're going to be popular here, although I'll try and diversify. This one is from Guardians founder, Sam Hitt. Thank you for the question, Sam. Is Guardians working on the reintroduction of the grizzly bear to the Southwest, in particular to the Mogollon Rim country?
Not at this time. That's trying to work on the wolves getting accepted in Colorado first, but I know there's been discussion of Wolverine in Colorado and potentially grizzly bears farther south. So stay tuned.
Thank you, Lindsay. This one looks like it's for you, Andrew. It's from Richard Spots, longtime Guardians member and former BLM employee. Richard asks, BLM bought out livestock grazing permits in tortoise habitat in Kern County, California, to mitigate for the loss of tortoise habitat for new solar development. Could this mitigation approach be expanded given the massive proposed expansion of solar development and the degradation of millions of acres of BLM lands from excessive livestock grazing? And Kelly, if you want to take that, feel free to do so, but I throw it to you first, Andrew.
Sure. And my response to that would be the need for permit retirement legislation. There are opportunities to do some administrative retirements that can help get cattle off of our public lands, but really having stronger legislative capabilities to be able to facilitate what could kind of be seen as buyouts in some way would help, I think, facilitate the ability to remove cattle from our public lands. And then Kelly, perhaps as related to solar developments, you might speak to that.
Yeah, and I think one of the one of the issues there is that the siting has got to be done right on that solar development, because if they, and I know one of the issues that they have been having out there is that they are talking to people who are on the ground out there, is that there is a concern that they are running out of mitigation lands that are suitable, because they are going into so much of the best, so many of the better areas. So I think that that you can talk about mitigation, but it is not a substitute for doing the siting right. I can say that there are organizations that have been talking about wanting to do livestock permit retirement as mitigation for these projects and for other kinds of extractive projects for some time. So people are definitely thinking about it and are proposing it. So I know that there are people that are considering it. What the holdup is on it, I don't know. You know, why it's not being done more, but Richard, I can tell you that there are organizations that are definitely thinking about it, and have been thinking about it for some time.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you, Richard, for the question. I have one more kind of open-ended question. It's from a longtime Guardians member and supporter, and then we'll get to closing reflections. We might go a moment long. This one's from Elliot Stern, and his question is, what new initiatives is WildEarth planning, and how do they relate to your strategic plans? Big question. What I will offer, whilst any of you think about answering the question, is that Guardians is engaged in a strategic planning process now through this transition. We wanted to have clear guidance for the organization going forward. There'll be news about a new executive director coming in the ensuing weeks. So that planning process is ongoing and coming to a conclusion. But do one or two of you want to touch on a new initiative and how you think that relates to current work and builds off of it?
I'll jump in. I won't say necessarily that's a new initiative, but you know, earlier on I said something that gives me hope and optimism is engaging more people. And I personally am a birder, and come from a birding kind of background, bird conservation background. And so I think that WildEarth Guardians, we could do a better job of reaching out to and engaging the millions really of birders that are out there, and giving them agency to understand how the places that they care about, where they go birding, that they can have an impact on how they're being managed to ensure the conservation of bird species.
Thank you, Andrew.
I'm just gonna say one word, which is beavers, and you know, you'll hear more about beavers soon. But yeah, ecosystem engineers, as you said, John.
Great. Thank you, Lindsay. All right, I'd like to be mindful of time and get to closing reflections. And I wanted to close asking each of you a very personal question, at least insofar as I relate to it, which is why Guardians? What is the ethical duty of a Guardian as you understand it? And I'll offer that I came to Guardians 30 years ago. Sam hired me fresh and young out of a job that I had in Washington, D.C., and I've been grateful ever since to be a Guardian. The notion of guardianship has been around for centuries, since ancient Roman times. And it's a long-standing sort of calling of humanity that we protect the vulnerable. So I'd like each of you to offer a brief reflection about why Guardians is a calling to you and what it means to you. And I didn't create an order here, so please, someone jump in and we'll get to each of you and then we'll close.
I can go first again. Happy to do so.
Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, you know, when one says that they're a wild earth guardian, I think it comes with a certain connotation, certain responsibility. And I think about it from the perspective a bit of my 6-year-old daughter. She hears that I am a wild earth guardian, and so she sees me as a protector. And I think about that responsibility to protect her, to protect our planet, the wildlife, and the ecosystems that give us life. So she sees me as a protector of the wild earth. I see me as a protector of the wild earth. And I think as guardians, then we have the expectation and responsibility to fulfill our mission and duty to be protectors of the wild.
Beautiful. Thank you, Andrew. Why don't we go Kelly, Lindsay, Sam?
For me, it comes from experiences of finding out that an area that I was helping to protect had a species that was going to probably go extinct because of a project proposed there. And even though I didn't know anything about it, listing petitions, if I didn't start working on a listing petition, nobody else was going to. And that kind of having to jump in and do it. And then many experiences of sitting in the homes of people and handing them Kleenex, and sitting with tribal elders and handing them Kleenex as they told me their stories. And so being a guardian means honesty and fiercely protecting and defending. And that's what it comes down to me.
Lovely. Thank you, Kelly. Lindsay?
Yeah, I mean, I think both of what Andrew and Kelly said rings true to me as well. And I think it's about, having voice to interests that are not well represented. I think Guardians comes in and is able to take on those challenges. And I think there's a lot of people that actually want support and want people who to stand up and be guardians. And we're trying to represent not only the voiceless of nature and species, but also those people who just don't know how to go about getting change. Happy to represent those interests as well, which I think is a lot bigger than, as Kelly was pointing out, the number of people who work in oil and gas, these special interest groups.
Thank you, Lindsay. Sam?
One of my values is the nature and the wild in and of itself has inherent value. It is not about extraction, and that these places are there to be extracted. And so it is really bringing that voice, the voice of nature, the voice of the wild, being able to elevate that voice to the table. And then the other piece of it for me has always been about fighting the forces that create more pollution, air, water pollution, and that are not paying attention to the impacts of that on people. I feel very strongly about the imbalance and the injustice and the primacy that are given to extractive industries, those who would consume nature and its places, those who would consume, and then as a result of that, really put out the pollution that damages people, that damages our quality of life, that really sidelines those kinds of concerns. And that's really what being a guardian means to me.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you, the 5 of you, for your spirited engagement as guardians. I wish you well going forward. And I wanted to close with the Guardian's reflection from each of you, because I love the word. I always have. I'm not going to get emotional. But it's something that is both like very universal. We're all guardians. And it's very unique. It's a unique calling. And so the universal calling is in each of us, but it's got to be nurtured. The unique calling is, to me, not everyone is up for protecting something vulnerable against something very powerful. So what I would say to our audience and our members and our longstanding supporters is thank you for heeding the call. It is something deep within you, I know, for heeding that call, for being a guardian yourself, for coming to the work of WildEarth Guardians and supporting our work The challenge will only rise in the years ahead of guardianship. And thank you all for doing that vital, spirit work. It's hard and it's a great calling, and we're lucky to do it. So thank you all, and we'll see you again soon. Adios.